Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Create Connects. Today we're covering in more detail the increase in theatre capacity for theatres, cinemas and concert halls with guests from New South Wales Health and Sydney Opera House. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us here are located somewhere on Aboriginal land across this vast place now called New South Wales. I live and work on Gadigal and Bidjigal lands and pay respects to elders past, present and future. My name is Bec Dean and I'm an acting senior manager in policy and partnerships at Create New South Wales. There are two of my Create New South Wales colleagues on this platform, Merrilee Ray and Ivana Jovanovic, who will help moderate your questions as we go. And so that we can focus on our speakers, we ask that you mute your microphones for now and turn off your cameras. There's a chat box that you can open up on the right-hand side of this go-to window. Oh, look, there's a handy list here that my colleagues have made. So basically, you click on in the centre of this top part of the screen, view everyone. In my case, I can only click view who's talking because there's something wrong with my application. And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box on the right hand side and ask questions that you need answered to in relation to this 50% capacity increase. There's also some good folks from AI Media who are captioning this webinar as we go. And the webinar is being recorded so that others may be able to find this information on our website over the coming weeks. So today I'm joined by the fabulous Laura Colley from New South Wales Health and Lou Oppenheim from the Sydney Opera House. Laura will present the key details that have changed in theatres and concert halls and opera houses and cinemas. And then Laura and I will attend to some questions that we've received earlier in terms of the frequently asked questions that we're getting. And we're also going to take some questions from the chat box. So you might start writing those now. But before I start on that with Laura, I just want to address, we've received a lot of questions about outdoor activities and whether you can apply the theatre guidelines to an outdoor event. And the short answer to that at this present moment is no, you can't. However, there's a lot of work that's going on to attend to these issues very quickly in government. And they're very aware that this is a central concern for many arts and culture organisations. But presently, outdoor events are limited by the 20-person gathering limit, as described in the current public health order. And the government is working urgently to address outdoor events. So we do anticipate announcements and checklists to be delivered on outdoor events in the coming weeks. And initially, these events will likely cover the kinds of events that we're talking about now only in an outdoor capacity. So basically talking about seated, ticketed, prescribed seating events in the outdoors. So my advice to you is if you're undertaking an outdoor event before the end of the month, there's a link that Ivana has just put in the chat box, which is for major recreation facilities, stadiums and showgrounds, and that is likely to be the kind of template for the outdoor events to be sort of worked upon and changed for that. For those kinds of events. So if you're in the planning phase, I'd encourage you to take a look at those and start your planning around those guidelines. until the new checklists are in place. So also, if you're undertaking an event before the end of the month and you're really desperate to get an exemption, you can go through a process to get an exemption. But if you are, if your event falls outside of that timeline, I would suggest that you wait for guidelines to become available, and then you won't need to be going through an exemption process. Okay, so I might now invite Laura. Hopefully Laura is here. I've seen her on the screen.
I'm here.
Hi. Hopefully, Laura, the stuff that I've conveyed about outdoor is correct. But yes, at the moment we don't have guidelines for these particular kinds of events to be transferred into the outdoors, but we are anticipating them
imminent announcements is what we are anticipating.
Yeah. Okay, so Laura, did you want to take us through first the main changes to the theatres and cinemas 50% capacity limit?
Yeah, sure. So we've got two options now for calculating capacity limits in entertainment facilities. So there's still the 1 per 4 square metre option there for places to use. And then there's an additional other capacity limit that some facilities might want to use because that may work better for them, which looks at seating capacity. So an event needs to be seated and ticketed. And if it is, then you can use 50% of seated capacity of the venue up to 1,000 people as well. So there's two options. Some will work better for some sort of businesses. So that 1 per 4 square metres is the whole premises. So for some that have a lot of foyer space, a lot of extra space around their facility that's publicly accessible, that may work better for your calculation. But for others that have quite small and are mostly just the theatre space itself, and for those it's probably the 50% seating capacity that's going to work out higher for them too. So there's two different options that can be looked at, and it will be different depending on the facility as to which one works better for your business.
Yeah, so that's the key change really that's in the new checklist that's on the website. So we encourage you to re-look at your COVID safe plans in light of that. Obviously, Laura, we've got quite a few questions, and these questions tend to fall into two categories. One of which is questions about gathering in the venue, and then the second kind of tranche of questions are coming in around what can happen backstage, on stage, those kinds of things. So what we might do now is actually just go through some of the questions that have been asked of us and the answers that Laura has prepared. These frequently asked questions and the questions from today will then go up on our website and be accessible for others who might not have joined this conversation. Okay, so the first question that I have is related to how many, I'm sorry, I've got an old version of this, apologies. I'll just start with how far away from the stage should the audience seating start?
It depends on what the activity is. So obviously there are higher risk things that can be done on stages like group singing or certain instruments such as non-reeded woodwind. So again, it just depends. We've put out advice regarding singing distances and non-reeded woodwind instrument distances too. So at the moment we're recommending 5 meters distance between singers and the audience, and 3 meters in the direction of airflow from non-reeded woodwind instruments. So those are just our general guidance as well. It's as a workplace as well, you're able to get your own advice on that too. So for example, if there's other things that you want to put in place to mitigate the risks a bit more, then you could potentially have more people singing than what we recommend or change distances slightly. You just need to get some expert advice to have a look at what you're proposing to do differently from the New South Wales Health advice to check that it's still okay and keeping people safe. So it really depends on the activity on the stage as to what our recommended distance is. We still have the general recommendation of 1.5 meters between people where possible.
So basically, if I'm interpreting what you're saying right, if I have a flute, for instance, and this is the direction of the audience I'm playing the flute this way with the airflow going to the direction of the audience, then the distance would need to be 3 metres. But if I went this way and the direction of the airflow is going towards backstage, then you don't need to apply that 3 metres.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of airflow forwards as well when you're playing the instrument, so it's a wedge shape that the 3 metres would be in. But yeah, if you just position the person differently, it's just in that direction that we recommend this additional distancing to 3 metres for those instruments, 1.5 for others.
Great. The next question is around what's happening on stage. So this person is presenting a end-of-year dance school presentation with 30 children. We've also had an update to that question, which is between 150 and 200 children. What are the rules of physical distancing in the back of house at the theatre that they're going to be working in?
Our general rule is 1.5 metres wherever possible. We note that for some performances and everything, you're not going to be able to keep that at all time, but just backstage where you can, just keeping that additional distance. Respiratory viruses tend to spread most in that 1.5 metres, so just having that distance gives a bit of buffer, and what you're doing is decreasing the exposure time when you decrease the amount of time people come into close proximity. So just really trying to get that 1.5 metres wherever possible.
And again, this is, I guess, a related question. Is there a limit to how many people I can have on stage in a performance in terms of the 20 people gathering rule?
No, so the 20 people gathering rule doesn't apply on the stage, and the capacity limit doesn't apply to the people on the stage either. So it's just the audience in the publicly accessible space that capacity limit applies to. So there's no limit on the number of people you have on a stage, except for the size of the stage is going to be a limiting factor. But no, the gathering limit doesn't apply on a stage.
So the guidelines specify that a seated group of individuals should be separated by 1 or 2 empty seats on both sides to support physical distancing. Does both sides mean either side on the same row, or does it also include in front and behind a seated group?
Yeah, so we've taken a slightly nuanced approach with this, and we generally recommend 1.5 metres, but in discussions with a lot of these facilities, there can be just a few centimetres difference, or 10 to 20 centimetres difference between the rows, and we understand the impacts on the businesses can be quite significant. And it's also lower risk in that people sit down, they're not talking or singing loudly, or they shouldn't be. So it's a slightly lower risk setting than in some other places as well. So we're being a bit more lenient in the advice in terms of front and behind, because everyone's facing the same way as well. So we're focused more on the side to side and 1 to 2 seats. And again, that's just to give it a bit more leniency. We recommend 1.5, but if it's 10 to 20 centimetres and it makes a big impact on the business, we wanted businesses to be able to use their judgment there and not be unfairly fined or anything for a few centimetres difference between what we're recommending and what people are putting in place.
Great. And so in front, we basically can seat every row because everybody is facing in the same direction.
They're facing the same way, sitting, not yelling or singing along or anything like that, then it's a lower risk setting, and we're happy to, rather than focus on the 1.5 too much, just focus on the sides where there's a little bit of higher risk and leave the front and behind whilst they're facing the same way.
Great. So this is a question just digging into that 50% capacity and the 4 metre square rule. So the new rules for theatres states 4 square metres per person or 50% capacity, whichever is the greater. So if the 4 square metre rule enables 150 audience members, but 50% enables 250 audience members, we can go with that 250 audience members as the greater. Is this the case?
Yes, I would go with that.
Great. Okay, the next question is kind of about volunteers and workers. This person runs a theatre that's entirely staffed by volunteers. Should they be included as workers within the venue capacity?
So staff or volunteers would both be included as staff and do not need to be included in your capacity calculations because it's their job to be there whether they're being paid for it or not.
Great. So this is a question about general admission ticketing. this person runs a venue that normally does general admission, so things are seated but they're not assigned. Do they need to assign specific seats to patrons through their ticketing process?
You don't need to assign a specific seat, but you need to make sure that people are sitting with those 1 to 2 seats on either side. So you just need to have a process in place for ensuring that's happening. So whether that's supervised sitting, so ushered or similar, where they make sure that those distances are being put in place. Assigning a seat just makes it a lot simpler, but if they don't want to do that, they just need to have processes in place to ensure that those 1 to 2 seats on either side are still being kept blank.
Yeah, and I guess it's also a contact tracing tool, I guess, to have assigned seating, because then it enabled, in the case of an outbreak or someone with a case of COVID, that New South Wales Health are more easily able to track everyone. Otherwise, everybody is really implicated in that.
Yeah, so it can decrease the number of people we need to isolate if we've got a better picture of where people are sitting as well. So if we're not sure where they're sitting and there's transmission in an event, then it's likely everyone that attended that would need to go into isolation, and that would likely include your performers as well. Whereas if we've got a better picture of where people have sat and an idea of how that might have spread around, then we can really focus in on who we isolate, and that would minimise the impact on other people, again, including the performers.
The next question that I have is from someone who works with a flexible venue. So they have seats, but they're not sort of in rows. They change the way that they format the space according to what the program is. How do they calculate the capacity of their space?
So if there is seated capacity beforehand and it's seated ticketed, then they could still use the 50% as long as they're meeting those requirements. But for some of those, the 4 square metre rule might work better. Again, it depends on the venue itself. But if it's already seating there, then they can just use that capacity for their calculations.
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, I would kind of advise that you negate the area that you'd be using for your stage. You'd negate your egress and ingress areas, and then you make your calculation based on the actual position of the seats on the ground.
Yeah, and you'd still need that 1.5 metres as well. If they're not all facing the same way, then you don't have those rows in front where you can have people closer to, so it's not you probably wouldn't be able to get as many people in with that seating configuration, the density and the risks. But yeah, so that 1.5 metres would still need to be in place there.
Yeah. So this question is from someone that is looking at a cabaret venue. So it's kind of a venue that probably falls under a different licence, and there's been a lot of discussion, lots of media about this over the last few weeks in relation to pubs and clubs and people operating under different sorts of premises licences. So in terms of cabaret spaces, what guidelines should those businesses be looking at?
Yeah, we're aware of the issue as well that's being brought up, and we're working with government to put in a fix to this that, again, we're hoping will be announced imminently too, that will make this much easier to use. That it would be the same as if it's being used as an entertainment facility, then that's how we would see the risk and how it should be used. But we're aware of the issue and we're working to fix that now.
Yeah, so at the moment, if those venues are under a sort of pubs and clubs type liquor licence, they'd probably fall into that category at the moment, but there is work being done to...
It's 1 per 4 square metre at the moment, but there's work being done very rapidly at the moment to address this.
Great. Okay, now I might move on to the questions that we're just having dropped in at the moment. So I will look at these. Yes, so someone's asked for confirmation that if events are ticketed and seated, they can go up to 50% capacity. Yes, that's the case. If you're in this kind of facility, yes. There's a question for you about whether you can advise if infants on laps would be added to a head count.
Yeah, unfortunately, the way the legislation is worded is that all humans count as a person, so they would be included under the capacity.
Okay. And we did just answer the question about allocated seating, so I think we can move on. there are questions about things on stage, and I think that basically this things on stage need to be sort of covered in the COVID safe guidelines that have been produced by the venue. And also the COVID safe guidelines produced by the organisation that is running the rehearsals and working with the artists to produce the work of art that is going onto the stage. So, or the work of theatre that's going onto the stage, or the work of dance. So it's all in those sorts of guidelines that you can basically undertake your business and transfer it to the stage where those COVID safe plans exist for both of those businesses. Is that correct, Laura?
Yeah, there's a general industry safety plan template on the website as well that helps, but it's very general. It's essentially the same principles that we advise for any safety plan. So it would be up to the organisation to have their own for how they're operating, because it wouldn't just be for the event itself, it's everything else that the organisation does too. The biggest thing that they can do is just make sure if people are unwell that they stay home. And do not come in and encouraging COVID testing for people who are unwell, because once someone's in there, it's likely to spread. So keeping that out is the best thing to do. We encourage them to look at physical distancing, and again, just trying to keep 1.5 metres wherever possible is really helpful. Not crowding too many people into little rooms. Those are the sort of things that can help decrease risk of spread should someone infected be involved. Hygiene and cleaning, so lots of hand sanitizer, so people, prompts as well for people to wash their hands, because it's touch your face and other things a lot of times throughout the day, so just keeping good hand hygiene. And record keeping can be really useful as well, particularly in workplace settings, remembering who has room, again, so that we don't have to isolate the entire workforce. If we're not sure, we can really target that in if we've got good information around where people have been and who they've been in contact with. So those are the sort of principles. We've got some advice again around the singing in the woodwinds that are specific, but otherwise it's general advice that would apply to other workplaces as well.
Yeah, so there's some great tools and resources that have been developed by industry as well around this. So where you're an organisation, you want to take I guess, very rigorous measures to ensure that your dancers, your actors, the people that are working for you are safe and kept safe through the process of working with them. The Live Performance Australia have produced some guidelines that will be very useful to the sector, and I'll put those on the website as well. As the Live Entertainment Industry Forum have also produced very solid guidelines to support your you to develop your COVID safe plans. So it's really kind of a matter of looking at what is legislated and required, and then the measures that you want to take as an organisation or as a group of people working together to ensure your own safety and the safety of the people that you come into contact with. So those resources are really, really detailed. They've been looked at by an independent epidemiologist, so it's a good resource for you to check into. Oh, this is a really good question. This is a question related to a theatre that would run in a single space, would run several sessions over a day. So I guess it's in a very similar way to the way that cinemas operate with multiple sessions over a day, and these guidelines do cover both. Do you have a position, does health have a position on multiple sessions, and what should happen when you're running multiple sessions?
Yeah, you just need to have strategies in place for managing gatherings that would occur before and after, during intermissions as well. So just staggering start and finish times is a really good strategy to help manage that, so that you don't have people from lots of different sessions mingling at the end or beginning. Because again, if there is someone that is a case that's there and you've had all of those sessions mingling together, then that's a much bigger potential exposure that's happened, and again, a lot more people that we'd need to isolate, but a lot more people that would potentially be infected too. So looking at staggering the start and finish times is a really good strategy, and just having processes in place to really move people in and out so that they're not standing around indoors together for too long too.
From a hygiene perspective, and I guess cloth seats and the use of cloth seats, and whether COVID-19 sort of lingers on textiles in between this kind of session, what would you suggest around that?
doesn't linger so well on the soft textiles. It's more the hard surfaces where it sticks around for longer. So concentrating on frequently wiping down hard surfaces with a disinfectant detergent solution, so that's where the virus does, and the research shows that it sits around longer on those sort of surfaces, but not so much on the soft furnishings.
Great. That's so interesting. It's sort of almost, it doesn't feel like it should be, because we've all sat on a gross seat before.
Yeah, it sticks around the areas that are easier to clean.
So this is another question about, I guess, a booking. So if a group of people know each other, can they sit together? If they book together, can they sit together?
We're not expecting entertainment facilities to do analyses of everyone and what sort of contacts they are to each other. If they're a social group that normally spend quite a bit of time together, then it would be reasonable that they would all sit together because of the contact that they have. Whereas if it's a group of people that don't know each other and are coming together, then we would recommend they have that distancing. So there's not a one fit rule. They could all sit together, but it just depends on the group and if they all want to sit together and if that's the sort of contacts that they are.
We do have another question, which I think we've attended to, but this person might have entered late. But they're asking if you can clarify the 1 or 2 seat spacing in a 50% capacity seated venue. And we kind of discussed that, you know, that the preference is for 1.5 metres between booked groups.
Yeah, as close as we can get to 1.5. Not strict. There will be groups that sit together, but yeah, just that as close as can be done with 1.5 that works for your business model on either side.
Right. This is another question regarding contact tracing. So if the venue has a bar open, can we use box office patron data to capture where a group booker is responsible for knowing their group? So it's like, I think we have covered this before in a previous webinar, but that booking is sufficient at the present moment in terms of contact tracing everyone else.
Yeah, at the moment, entertainment facilities, we recognise that it's usually done by group bookings, and so that makes it a much easier way to trace it. It would be good to have a sort of checkbox in there for the person that they take in responsibility for being the point of contact for that group. For families and etc., it doesn't make sense to collect all the details for each person as well, but just making sure that that person is aware that they are the contact, because we need to do it quite quickly to find all the details of everyone as well. So just having that little checkbox in there would help, but at the moment for entertainment facilities, 1 for the group is sufficient.
Yeah, so this is a bigger question about, I guess, larger groups like school bookings. So if a classroom who normally sits together, etc., could they all be seated together in the theatre context?
Yeah, if they're usually seated together in a classroom, then they can all be seated together in an entertainment facility as well. It's the same principles. If it's different from different groups or different class, different grades, then that's different because it's not the same people that they would be in contact with all the time, so it's higher risk. But yeah, if it's a group that usually sits together, then it would be the same in an entertainment facility.
So would you suggest in that case that if there are 2 classes coming, that they just create that distance between them in the theatre?
Yeah, just having the distance between the 2 classes.
Another sit on another side and they get the 1.5 gap between those rows.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So we've also covered the issues around performing on stage, and so that's another question that's come up. So, but I think we've covered that off quite thoroughly. And I think that we've covered off the group booking question in terms of a social club or a social group that hang out together. If they're a group of 20, what would you suggest with that?
Yeah, and again, if it's a group of 20 that's always around each other, then that doesn't change the risk that they sit together in a cinema or a theatre. It would just depend on the group, but if that's what the group is, then there's no problem all 20 sitting together if that's normal for them.
This is a question in relation to spoken word plays, so not singing, not dancing, not playing a flute. The distance from those performers would be 1.5 metres.
Generally, it would be 1.5. there's higher risks when you project your voice because those respiratory particles spread further. So singing is the highest because that pushes the respiratory particles the furthest, and the shaking of the vocal cords as well really disperses it out. That's why we have 5 meters for singing. For people that are speaking a lot louder than they normally would be, doubling that to 3 meters is a good rule of thumb, just for that extra precaution. Again, it just depends on what the activity is.
There is another question about the classification of entertainment facility and licensed venues, pubs, clubs. This participant has a hotel license. So presently they are under the pubs and clubs legislation. However, the main product of their activity is live music. So this is an issue that has come through Parliament. It's being addressed very seriously now by health and other layers of government. So at the moment it does sit within the pubs and clubs guidelines and not these particular guidelines, but it is being worked on presently. That's our understanding.
Yep.
Yep. And I think we've covered off the non-speaking. Someone's asking a question about non-speaking puppeteering and the distance between
yeah, and 1.5 is fine for those activities, and anything that's at a normal speaking volume, 1.5. It's just when you're going above that you sort of increase that respiratory particle distance.
So there's another question on basically that engages with the practice of making performance-based work, where artists are in close contact. There might be wrestling or dancing on stage. This should be covered in your COVID safe plan for your organisation. So you can do that work, but you do need to undertake a risk management plan and look at how you are sort of protecting your workers to engage in this practice. That's my understanding, Laura. Is that what you were saying too?
We haven't been too prescriptive in what you can do on the stage because we recognise there's a very broad range of things that can happen. So it's really just understanding what your risks are and planning around those. It's fine to do whatever these activities need to be on stage are, recognising you can't keep 1.5 metres away and do all of the things you need to do on stage to perform. So it's really looking at, again, those 4 key principles, keeping people away when they're sick, because if someone is sick and performs as part of this troupe that is in very close contact with each other, then it's highly likely that they will infect the others as well. So just making sure that the troops, anyone that's unwell stays home. The rest of the time trying to keep that 1.5 metres distance, so you're really decreasing that exposure time as well. The longer the time you're in close contact with someone who's infected, the higher the risks that you will catch that infection. And again, good hygiene, hand hygiene, and just making sure you've got the records of who's been in that close contact with each other and when, so that we can isolate appropriately.
Okay, so there's someone online who is working with 15 improvisers. 7 are rehearsing together and 6 are working with Zoom. And the 7 in the room are social distancing. Basically, what you need to look at, I'm sorry, because the names don't come up on this chat for me, so you're attendee 26 to me at the moment, but what you really need to look at is your COVID safe plan, and to engage with information that WorkSafe can provide on this as well. So when you're working together as a group, you kind of need to have a COVID safety plan together, because you're creating work and what you're doing is work. So I understand that you're having some difficulty in engaging with all of your group to sort of come together. And I think this is the issue, I guess, is it's incumbent upon people that are doing this work to sort of create the safe context for their work to take place. And as with the work that we're doing currently in the office here, a lot of people are electing not to come in at the moment because they personally don't feel safe. And legislation is great, but it's still legislation still won't stop COVID from happening, and so people are people have clear concerns about undertaking the activities they were doing before this pandemic. So as much as you can, I guess, create that context for them, but ultimately it's up to those individuals as to whether they want to participate, I think. Yeah, it's very challenging at the moment. A lot of people are differently affected by this disease, and so they're taking the measures that are relevant to them. Yeah. I think that we have gone through a lot of questions. There is a question here about should singers be 5 metres from musicians in a pit? And we're going to be talking about singing next week. I probably won't be joined by Laura at that time because I'm calling on her quite a lot to answer lots of questions. But again, this is about your COVID safe plan. So the singing is health advice. The 5 metre distance between singers is advice from health, but it isn't part of legislation. Is that correct, Laura?
Yeah, so at the moment our advice is 5 metres in front of the singers from any other person, so that includes conductors or anyone else, just because that's the really high risk zone in front of them right there where all of those particles are spraying out, and if there's COVID there, then that's a really high risk setting. So our advice is to have 5 metres between the singers and the next person, whoever that is, so that would include musicians as well. If you want to do something differently from that, then you can have a look at how you could change things or put barriers or anything else around there, but we would recommend you get your own advice around that as well. And that's just really from a work health safety perspective, where under the occupational legislation, you're required to take reasonable steps to protect the people in your organisation. At the moment, our advice is that the reasonable steps are the 5 metres. If you want to do something differently, you can do that. You just should get advice to make sure that you're still protecting your staff and everyone else involved.
Yeah. Does that 5 metre apply to group singing or only, or also individual singers? Yes, it's also individual singers. It's anyone singing. Yeah.
Yeah, so at the moment our general recommendation is to keep groups of singers to groups of 5 and then have 5 metres in front of them and 1.5 between each of them as well, just because we have a bit of virus still circulating in the community, and we know from experience here and overseas that when someone is infected and sings in a group, it's very likely that it will spread to the others in that group as well. So we're just keeping those groups small at the moment, and that 5 metres in front is the next person, whether that's an individual singing or a group of 5 singing, still the same risk in that area.
There's another question about someone running an event over multiple venues, and they have a COVID safe plan for their practice, and they're asking whether the plan should be registered for each venue, given each venue would have their own plan. I would suggest each venue has their own plan.
Yeah, and we don't require entertainment facilities to register, but registering gives you a QR code through Service New South Wales as well that can be used for record keeping, and it's a really good way for us to be able to let you know when there's any changes to advice or legislation too. So it's not required that entertainment facilities register, but it's still a good idea because it gives us that better contact with you and can let you know when there are changes. But I would suggest each venue would be better to have their own, just because it's going to be slightly different at each one, and you need to make sure that everyone, all the staff, knows what the safety plan is for that specific venue and what they need to do and how people are going to be moved around and in and out and everything. So it's a good idea to have one for each venue.
There are yet more questions about the 5 metre singing distance. So again, we just want to be clear. I think we're going to cover singing on a webinar on Monday, because it is a challenging thing to understand what is advice, what is legislation, what is covered by health, what is covered by your work safe and occupational health and safety. So if you are doing a musical where people are singing and dancing on stage, obviously you're not going to be able to keep them 5 metres distance apart. So you have to have a COVID safe plan that maintains your the health of your performers and looks after them. So that is basically the advice, and you need to be looking at that project as work, and that you have workplace safety engaged in your COVID safe planning. Would that be correct, Laura?
Yeah, so our advice has to be population level, because that's what we need to do. So we have to cover these activities in all the different places that they happen, and this is the general advice. When these activities are happening all across the state while there's low levels of virus, this is what we suggest everyone does. Performing on a stage is obviously a special activity that we haven't put these same or as much focus on, but the general advice is there. Obviously, it's not doable for a musical to just have 5 people on stage singing with 5 meters in front. So for that, we would recommend, again, just getting some advice on your own safety plans and making sure that you're still managing the risks as much as you can, whilst noting that you need to be able to operate and do what you need to do in order to run as a business or an organisation.
Right. So there's also more questions about timing between multiple performances held on the same day. So Laura's already covered that it would be great if you staggered these timings so that people have an ability to clear the space before you have another lot of people coming into that same space. Correct, Laura?
Yeah, it's just going to make it a lot easier for you to manage any crowding and the people moving around.
Yeah.
And looking at those crowding points as well, so you know that the lines for the bathroom are going to be a crowding risk, and the lines at the bar are going to be a crowding risk as well. So just minimising the times that each of those groups will be queuing up for those things will really help you manage the crowd flow.
There's another question about reeded and non-reeded instruments here, about the difference between reeded, woodwind and brass. So you have put some clarifications in the latest advice about reeded and non-reeded instruments.
Yeah, so as the case numbers have been dropping, we've had better control. We've been able to adjust the advice on musical instruments, and what we're really focusing on now is the highest risk settings. And for musical instruments, those are the non-reeded woodwinds, where in the direction of flow, because of their design, they spit out at a further distance a lot more respiratory particles. The reed slows down that movement, so it's less high risk in that we don't have the same expulsion of respiratory particles. And the brass instruments, because of the vibrations as well, we don't see that same expulsion of air. So we're really just focusing on the highest risk settings here, which are those non-reeded woodwinds in the direction of airflow.
So we're sort of talking about flutes here and piccolos.
Flutes, piccolos, recorders, those that are designed to spit air out in very big distances in a tube at the highest risk settings, and so that's what we're focusing the risk mitigation on for this.
So we're having yet more questions about capacity rules and what can happen on stage. So you can do the things that you need to do as part of the work of creating your theatre piece, your dance piece, your multimedia extravaganza, but you need to write a COVID safe plan around it. So you need to engage with your risk management for the people involved in the rehearsing of those events. So you need to really sort of do a solid plan that focuses on the health of your of the people involved, and that's a work safe kind of issue.
Yeah, there's no capacity.
The last question that we have is about what cleaning is required between multiple performances on the same day, and you need to have a cleaning plan as part of your COVID-19 safety plan. So it isn't mandated, you know, in legislation about how much cleaning you should do, but you have to have a plan to clean your space.
And there's guidance on cleaning and what we would recommend in the safety plan for entertainment facilities. So that cinemas, theatres, concert halls checklist has some general guidance around how to do that.
Great. So if we do have any more questions, we're going to have to wrap it up because we have to finish this webinar at 11 o'clock. Lou has yet to present on Opera House planning. So if you do have any more questions, please do send them to me, and I will attend to those questions over the next week and get them up on our website. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming in again and talking with us through some of these, through some of the nitty-gritty, I guess, of these issues, because everybody has very different places, very different projects, and coming to grips with new advice takes some time. So thank you so much for that.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Great. So now we'll move on to Lou Oppenheim, who is joining us from the Opera House, or probably from her home, potentially, maybe the Opera House, no? And Lou, you're going to be talking through how you're sort of engaging with this new advice from a perspective of Sydney Opera House.
Correct, and I am going to share my screen so I can talk some things specifically. So if you can just bear with me for one moment. Hopefully everyone can see that. So what I wanted to do, just do a very high level, I think it's been incredibly valuable to hear from Laura from a New South Wales Health perspective. Just to be clear, I'm not a New South Wales Health expert, but just to give a little bit of a practical interpretation about how we're looking at the New South Wales guidelines to make sure that kind of people get some of that more practical insights about how we're interpreting them. To start with, what I wanted to just outline is when we've really looked at our COVID safe planning, we've really followed 5 principles, and for those who are at a previous webinar presented at, these should be very familiar. The first 3 are very much around our safety protocols. First and foremost, making sure that we're safeguarding the wellbeing of everyone on our site, making sure that we do follow the New South Wales Government and New South Wales Health guidelines at all times. And I think it has been, you know, recognising it's complicated because a lot of jurisdictions are slightly different with slightly different rules. So making sure that we're very much keeping an eye on what New South Wales Health is guiding and what the New South Wales Government requires us to do as a New South Wales organisation. And that comes into the 3rd principle, which is about monitoring and managing those risks as things have changed over time. And there is a lot of information out there. And I acknowledge that it's actually been quite challenging for the industry to keep track. So these sort of webinars are a really great opportunity, and the information that's on Create New South Wales website to keep on track of those frequently asked questions. I think from an industry perspective, the other 2 principles we've also really tried to make sure that we keep a close eye on. One is that we still come to shows to have a great, excellent, amazing customer experience. And we want to make sure that those who come and see our shows have a consistent experience as much as possible across different theatres, different performing arts centres. So that's also something we've been working on, and also making sure that we can still put on amazing shows on our stages. And also making sure we can do that in a sustainable way, which is our final principle. Laura mentioned a couple of the lots of industry guidelines, and I just wanted to reiterate her comments about those. Actually, sorry, I think it was Becky mentioned them in terms of Live Performance Australia and the Live Entertainment Industry Forum guidelines that have come out. These are national guidelines, so I think that's something to be just keep in mind when you read them, in that they're not specific to any particular jurisdiction. But what they are really useful is a lot of industry consultation has gone into developing those guidelines, and they're a really useful checklist or starting thought process if you're starting to think about your COVID safe plan in your venue. So I would encourage you to check those out. There's been a lot of information shared in them. They can be a little daunting to read through, but they're a useful starting point if you're really starting on the journey about how you do COVID safe performances in your venue. Specifically, I'm conscious of time, but so the one thing I really did want to talk to was about how we're thinking about managing the changes to the capacity limits within our venues when we look to re-invite audiences back into our space. And as Laura outlined, there's been a change to look at, you can either do the greater of 50% capacity with 1 or 2 seats either side, or 1 person per 4 square metres of publicly accessible space with 1 or 2 seats either side. The Opera House has taken an approach that consistently across our venues, we're going to look at the 50% capacity rule as a way of managing this. And that is, for those who know the Opera House, you're probably aware of the complexity of our foyer spaces. We have, for 3 of our venues, we have a shared foyer space, which means if we start to think about how we analyse the 1.4 square metres within those foyers, our capacities within our venues then actually shift depending on how many venues we've got running at the same time. So it's actually quite a complex thing for us to manage, and actually the 50% for us as an organisation makes it something, given the number of events we normally run at the Opera House, it's something that we can really manage consistently from event to event to event. So the approach we have chosen to take, and this is our choice, is actually really to focus on that 50% capacity. There have also been quite a lot of questions within the chat around groups and how you manage that. We all deal with ticketing systems, and some of them are more flexible than others. For us, we're really looking at offering essentially 2 built ticketing plans. One is looking at individual seats, which are individually separated by those physical distancing rules. And the other is looking at primarily pairs of seats that groups who know each other suitably can buy together, again, separated through those physical distancing rules. And I've given an option there, an example there on the slide, where you can see the layouts for each of those. So this is our Playhouse Theatre, which is our smallest theatre. The normal capacity, when you ignore tech holds, is 399. With tech holds removed, it's 393. So that's taking out audio desks, which you can see there on the left-hand side of the plans in green or in purple. Which means at a 50% capacity, seated capacity, we're looking at a maximum of 196 humans in the venue. When we look at the single seating capacity, when we factor in the physical distancing, is that it's 184 seats plus wheelchairs and companions, because we want to make sure that our venues are still accessible to the widest community. What that enables people to do, however, is we can essentially sell all of those individual seats. People might still come with a group that they all know in terms of close contacts of 1 or 2 or 3 people, but they would end up in physically distanced seats between them. But enables us to have a set seating plan with multiple different group sizes, and all of those seats essentially can be sold across the venue. That's one option, and that's suitable for, we know for some of our shows that's the best option, because we have a whole range of different group sizes who occasionally might attend. We know a lot of people might come to a show or a festival on an individual basis, and we want to make sure there's the most flexibility in the selling pattern. The second option, which is the option that I've described on the right, is where we've got groups, primarily pairs, that we're selling. So people can choose, and it's a great experience to come along and sit with your partner or sit with a really close friend who you're in close contact with on a regular basis when you see a show. It's part of the joy of coming to see a live performance. So that enables people to actually be able to sit together, but for people who aren't close contacts, in essence, to still have that physical distancing between them. You'll see as the numbers, that actually enables us to sell about 210 seats, which is more than the 50% capacity. So we wouldn't do that, in that we'd still manage to the 196. But what it also enables is, if it happens within the group that there's only a group of 3 left and only 2 people want a seat, we end up with a seat kill for that second seat or the third seat in the group. So it enables a little bit more flexibility within the group sizes. But it also means you have to accept that within that fixed seating plan, you might end up with some seat kills within the groups, because you don't want groups who don't know each other sitting without that physical distancing between them. We would all love a dynamic, great ticketing system that can manage physical distancing on the fly as it comes in via groups. If anyone has got, without doing that I know there are some venues who are actually doing that on a manual basis, which is fantastic, essentially that people book and then they're manually allocating people into fixed seats. Because of the number of events the Opera House runs every year, that's not really a practical answer for us. So these are the 2 options that we're using to safely manage that 50% capacity, as well as the physical distancing within groups. A lot of the other tools that we're using in terms of managing the audience journey and the safety within the venue are all the things that we've all talked a lot about in terms of communication pre-purchase, managing people in terms of messaging are really about staying at home, which is related to our refund and exchange policies, making sure there's signage that people are aware of their requirements, making sure there's physical distancing on site, visible hand sanitizer, making sure there's perspex screens up in places like the box office, managing as much as possible the contactless ticketing, and that people are not handling paper tickets. All of the things that I think are outlined in those industry guides. We've also very much implemented a very carefully thought through cleaning plan, including between shows and staggering those start times for multiple shows in venues, as we've talked about already. The other things that we've been working on very closely is working with our backstage and our hirers in terms of making sure they're aware of our requirements when they come in and working in the house, and keeping our workers and their workers safe. One of that is around the COVID safe declaration that we've done, which is making sure people are aware of when they shouldn't come into work, if they're symptomatic, if they've visited a hotspot, if they've been in contact with someone with COVID. And that's really about preventing or eliminating the risk for coming in, and also making sure as much as possible people are physically distancing, keeping to that 1.5, all those other guidelines. But first, finally, I think also it's making sure we still have joyful shows on our stage. As you can see there, that's James Morrison with his band that came in a couple of weeks ago for our digital season. So it's making sure that still within all these guidelines, we still enable fantastic performances to happen on our stages. That is the world's quickest overview, but I just wanted to cover off, they're the main things I wanted to cover off. So thank you.
Thanks, Lou. That is so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Oh, there's a question for you. How are you managing the different distances required to front row audience?
So obviously the very specific guidelines now are very much about woodwind and singers. So we're looking particularly at those art forms when they come in to manage those, and if necessary, we will look at taking the front row or the second row off sale. You can also look at obviously the blocking on stage to adjust that. So both, it's not necessarily losing seats within the audience, but it's also looking at if you can adjust what's going on stage and the balance of those things. So it is very much working together with our hirers and working together with our performers on stage about how we manage the risks for both our performers as well as our audiences within those guidelines.
Now, there was a question that I got, which we weren't able to attend to because of the time, with Laura, but I was just interested in how you might be engaging with this. But just in terms of patrons and wearing masks, what's your position on that, Lou?
We're highly recommending masks where social distancing can't be maintained, and as we move to 50% capacity, when we're working with the Sydney Theatre Company, we'll also be, which they're already opening, some of you might be aware, they're open in the Rospacker Theatre, where masks are mandatory. So we're working with them to make sure there's consistency for their patrons about the messaging they're doing across their different venues.
Yeah, and I think that's something that different organisations are interpreting and I guess thinking about who their audience are, whether they're a vulnerable group, you know. So if you're looking at the audience for the Sydney Chamber Orchestra, or the Australian Chamber Orchestra or the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, you're looking at an older population. They might be more vulnerable. They might feel better if they're wearing masks. So it's kind of looking at those issues as well.
Yeah, and working through the complexity. I think for venues it does add a complexity in terms of food and beverage services and things like that. So you've got to think through a whole combination of things. But ultimately, we've got to make sure our audience is comfortable and we're managing the risks as much as possible.
Yeah. I noticed Laura is still around. Laura, do you have any mask advice from health?
Yeah, masks are useful as an additional tool by themselves. They're not a substitute for physical distancing. They don't work that way. So it is a good idea to encourage mask use when people are, especially when they're moving around the venue itself. And when there's vulnerable populations that do come to your show as well, What we've found as well is that mask use is increased when you make them available too. So having masks there for people that would like to use them when they walk in can be something that also makes people feel safe. So they're a useful additional tool, but they're not a substitute for physical distancing and managing crowding.
Yeah, so I guess it's where you can manage your crowding and your flows through your foyers into the space. That is a better proposition than wearing a mask, but wearing a mask where you can't guarantee that that's going to work is a good additional measure.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being available today. This has been recorded. Obviously, we're going to have it on the website. I'll attend to all of those frequently asked questions and add those to the ones that are up on the website at the moment. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. Obviously, we're suggesting that things are moving ahead in terms of outdoor activity, so be keen to hear from you and the things that you're planning around that. We are doing webinars next Monday on singing and playing instruments in groups. So I encourage those of you who are either performing in that way or presenting in that way to come to those webinars so that we can go over the issues at hand from health and from WorkSafe, and then attend to some of the more difficult questions that you have that we might be able to answer down the track. But thanks so much for joining us. Signing off. Have a wonderful Friday. It's a beautiful day.